Hello everyone, back to the 7th and final Spring 2020 Analogues update from GWV. So we started the Spring updates at the beginning of January. We've run them all the way through January and February. We've arrived at the last Sunday of February, and we've arrived at the final Spring 2020 update. So it's going to be a bit of a bumper edition. We're going to have both January and February data to go at, so a bit of an extended one, be the longest spring update that we've done, I think, ahead of the spring forecast being released a week today on Sunday the 1st of March. So bit of a bumper edition. Hope you find it interesting and informative. Just say it's going to be a long video, of course, because we've got 84 tabs to get through, so we're almost reaching sort of winter update levels with this one. So it's going to be a long video. You can't watch it all in one go, then the video will be placed on the spring updates page at GWV.com with a written summary. I'll get that up for you probably this evening. It's going to be a busy day, so I'll get it for you probably this evening. If not, it'll be tomorrow morning. But I will try and get the update onto the spring updates page this evening. It's also on the YouTube channel, of course, so you can watch the video on demand if you want, either at the GWV's YouTube channel or at GWV.com on the Spring Updates page. Later on, we're going to have GWV's Sunday Roundup, so that'll be your eclectic mix of this and that. It'll be just after lunch. And we'll have the ECDF Measure France DWD long-range update of sometime around 4 o'clock this afternoon probably, and ensembles what's in. So I say it is going to be a very busy day at GWV, so I may not be able to get the spring update on the spring updates page this evening, but I will endeavour to do that if I can. I've got to say a big thanks to Richard Trott for sending through the Spring Updates GIF. So big thank you to our good friend Richard for doing that. The first batch of analogues have been sent through by our analogues guru James Ackland. As I said in GWV Sunday Roundup, James has gone into hospital and had an operation that will involve quite an extended recovery period. And by the way, I have heard from James's family that James has come through the operation okay. The operation went fine. He's in hospital still, will be in hospital for quite a few days, but the operation itself went okay and he's into the recovery period. And a big thank you to all people who have inquired about James's health and passed on their best wishes. I'll pass those on to James, of course. So James sent the final batch of analogues that he's going to be able to do for a little while through to us before he went into hospital. That's where we're going to start this this update with. So a big thank you to Analogues guru James Ackland as always, and we're all going to say get well soon and come back to us soon, James. Right, so let's get on with it then. First batch of analogues comes from James Ackland, our analogues guru, and we're looking at for this first batch of analogues, we're looking at springs following January's with an England and Wales precipitation close to January 2020. Now, January 2020, England and Wales precipitation came out at 82.8 millimetres. So, for England and Wales precipitation. So, all of these springs are following January's that are around that sort of 80 millimetre mark. A little bit before 70 millimetres, a little bit beyond sort of to 90 millimetres, but they'll all be within that sort of ballpark of sort of 80 millimetres. The first spring is going to be the spring of 1841. Following, again, England and Wales precipitation in January, close to January 2020. So this one has above average heights up to our north, and it has below average heights over the top of the country. It looks like it's an unsettled spring, and maybe quite a coolish spring as well. We could be pushing in some quite cool air into that trough of below average heights. The next spring is 1843, following January England and Wales precipitation close to January 2020. This one unsettled again. Low pressure coming in off the Atlantic this time. Bit of a blocking signal, but quite weak. I think overall that's just a relatively mild, but also Atlantic-driven spring in 1843, and probably quite unsettled. The next spring is 1849. This one looks very unsettled. Deep trough of low pressure is covering much of northern and western Europe. It does have a blocking signal, but more towards Canada and North America. I think with this one, it could be quite a cold this spring due to the position of the trough of low pressure. So I think quite a cold but also unsettled spring in 1849. The next spring, following a January with England and Wales precipitation close to January 2020, is the spring of 1854. This one's our first anticyclonic spring. This one has above average height centred just to the north of the country, so high pressure is in control, probably bringing in quite a lot of eases. The thing with this spring is that, of course, spring is a transitional season, so that pattern in March is probably going to be cold and wintry, but that pattern in May is probably going to be relatively dry and also quite warm. So you pay your money, you take your choice, but an anticyclonic spring there for 1854. The next spring is 1857, and this one, again, with high pressure within the northern latitudes, but a weakened high pressure, and low pressure to the west-southwest. That one looks like it's Atlantic-driven, and probably relatively mild overall, although early on it could be quite cold, but I think overall probably relatively mild, but also quite wet. The next spring is 1862. This one looks very unsettled, low pressure through the country and into northern Europe as well. It looks Atlantic driven. I don't think it would be cold, probably quite a mild spring, but a very wet spring there. The next spring is 1874, and this one has below average heights to our east and above average heights out to the west and also to the north. Probably quite a coolish spring. Could be quite a coolish spring, that one, but a relatively settled spring as well. The next spring is 1894, and this one has below average heights to our south, above average heights to the north and to the northeast, probably bringing in a lot of easterly winds with this spring. Again, I think it could be quite an unsettled spring, particularly across southern parts of the country. Maybe quite a cold start, getting warmer perhaps later. Quite a long gap then through to 1925. Our next spring following England-Wales precipitation of around 80 millimetres, something like that, which is close to January 2020, is a spring of 1925. This one very unsettled, below average heights through much of Western Europe, above average heights pulled into the Atlantic. Jet stream is doing something like that. I don't think it's particularly cold spring, although there might be cool weather involved with that, but I think the main thing is a very, very wet spring, a real deluge of a spring in 1925. The next spring is 1931. This one has more in way of northern blocking sitting up to our north, high pressure to the north, low pressure over and to the south of the country, probably bringing in quite cold east to northeast winds. That could be a rather colder spring, I think, that one. Unsettled too, with snow potential. The next spring, only 1 year on, is 1932. Again, this one, cold potential, below average heights through northern and western parts of Europe, blocking centred over Greenland. This time, that's northern blocking over Greenland. That pushes cold air into that trough of low pressure, and so therefore that looks like it would be a cold and unsettled spring in 1932. 1934 is another one, so it looks like the early 1930s were pretty grim for springs, although the summers were quite good, I think, in the first half of the 1930s, but the springs don't look like they're up to much at all. Below average heights elongating through the west of Europe, above average heights pulled into the Atlantic. We go onto the cold side of a jet stream. That just looks like another very unsettled and potentially quite cold spring in 1934. 1944 is our next spring. This one, again, with below average heights to our east and above average heights out to the west. It's a more anticyclonic spring, probably quite cool, probably bringing in the winds from the west to northwest. So it wouldn't be a particularly warm spring. It's not like we're dragging up southerlies, but probably a reasonably settled spring in 1944, maybe relatively pleasant. 1945 next. This one has above average heights through many western parts of Europe, a lot of dry and mild weather on offer through the spring of 1945. That looks like a very, very nice spring there. And we've got 1946. Again, this spring is following January England and Wales precipitation close to that of January 2020. The spring of 1946 has above average heights again over and just to the north of the country, a trough of below average heights to our south. And I would thought a lot of easterly winds involved with this spring. Relatively dry, I would have thought. The Atlantic is blocked off and potentially quite mild or even relatively warm at times, despite the fact the high pressure is just a little bit to our northwest. I don't think it'll be a particularly cold spring. In fact, it probably is quite a mildish spring, that one. Spring of 1952 shows up next. This one with above average heights to the north and to the east, below average heights out to the west. Again, quite a lot of anticyclonic weather. This spring has a famous blizzard at the end of March, late March 1952, has a famous blizzard. Very severe weather. Otherwise, though, I don't think this spring was too bad. I think there's quite a bit of anticyclonic weather on offer during the spring of 1952. Spring 1955 is our next one, and that one again with above average heights sitting just to the north of the country, a trough below average heights to the west and to the east. Jet stream does something a little bit like that. And so again, quite a lot of dry weather. It's a bit of a continuation of the winter pattern. We have a cold winter in 1955, especially January and February. It's a bit of a continuation of that. Quite cold early in the spring. And a lot of dry weather as well through the spring of 1955. Quite a long gap to 1968. That's our next spring with below average heights through west of Europe and a deep trough over northern Scandinavia. A bit of northern blocking towards Greenland. That one's quite an unsettled spring. I don't think it's particularly cold, but it is quite an unsettled spring in 1968. The spring of 1979 shows up next. This one has northern blocking up towards Greenland and a deep trough part over top of the UK. It's a very cold spring in 1979 and it's unsettled. It's a continuation of the famous winter of discontent. We keep it cold into the spring, regular throwbacks to the winter pattern. And even into May of 1979, it is still snowing at times. Then we got the spring of 1982. This one has above average heights just to our south and southwest. Below average heights are up to the north. We bring in more of a westerly wind in the spring of 1982. It's a relatively mild spring. And just sort of classic type westerly showery conditions. Nothing particularly dramatic, I don't think, during this spring, and it is quite a mild spring. A long gap then again through to 2001. So this is how the spring of 2001 is looking. This one's more unsettled and colder. Has above average heights up towards Greenland, below average heights over much of northern western Europe. Jet streams to our south as well. So March and April of 2001 has regular cold intervals. There is snow in this spring as well in both March and in April to May 2001, whilst unsettled and quite wet at times, is quite a lot warmer. And then we've got the spring of 2002. And spring 2002 looks like that. It has above average heights just to our east and below average heights out to the west. Just doing something like that. This is a warmer spring in 2002. There's a lot of mild weather during this spring. I don't think there's hardly any cold snaps actually in this spring. So it's a mild but also relatively dryish sort of spring 2002. Very, very nice spring indeed. So putting all of that together, this is how all Marches combined are looking following springs, or in springs that follow Januaries with an England and Wales precipitation close to January 2020. And in March we get northern blocking. We have high pressure centred up towards Greenland and low pressure pushed southwards of the country and also to our east. The jet stream does something a bit like that. Those springs look potentially cold, bringing in the winds from the northeast, and also unsettled as well. All Aprils combined, also unsettled but milder. We lose the northern blocking, virtually vanishing, just a little bit left in the northern latitudes, but nowhere near enough to drive cold air in. Overall, we revert back to a westerly type pattern in the Aprils. Still unsettled though, still bringing low pressure in. But nowhere near as much cold potential in the Aprils as there is in the Marches. So overall the Aprils look milder, but quite unsettled. May, look at that, really deteriorates a lot. That trough of low pressure almost parts over the top of the country, and northern blocking begins to come back towards Greenland as well. That's a pretty grim looking anomaly for the all Mays combined following England and Wales precipitation close to January 2020. And then finally, for this batch of analogues sent through to us by James, we have All Springs combined. So this is how All Springs combined are looking following January with an England Wales precipitation close to January 2020. All Springs combined look unsettled. They have low pressure coming in off the Atlantic into northern Europe. High pressure up towards Greenland. Jet stream is pushed southwards. And yeah, just looking unsettled and potentially cold, particularly so in March. May also looking particularly looks particularly cool and unsettled. Little bit better, still unsettled in April, but probably a little bit milder as we revert back to a westerly wind. Big thank you to our Analogues guru, James Atquill, for sending through this last batch of analogues before James went into hospital, and we wish him all the best as he recovers from his operation. And James will be back with us as soon as he absolutely can. I think it'll be a little while, but James will be back as soon as he can, and we all wish James all the best in his recovery. Now, I want to do a little bit of pattern matching for this final video as well, for the spring updates. So, this is how January 2020 comes out in terms of its 500 millibar height anomaly. Just to say that with the pattern matches, it's subjective. Pattern matches are subjective opinion. I try to find the best matches I can find, but it's subjective. There's nothing factual about pattern matches. So, the pattern matches do not form part of the overall forecast that we're going to do next week. Just sort of for interest purposes and to give another slant on things, really. But it's not factual. The factual is like in January precipitation was 82.8 millimetres. That's fact. The CT, which you're going to see in a moment for February, is going to be factually somewhere in the low sixes. So that could all form part of the spring forecast, but pattern matches doesn't form part of the spring forecast. Nevertheless, it's worthwhile to try and pick out the closest matches we can find in any given season, and just adds an extra sort of flavour to things. So this is how the January 2020 500 millibar height anomaly came out. It was actually quite an anticyclonic month, had lots of low pressure up to the north, hence the very positive Arctic oscillation that we had during this January, and that does extend down into the Atlantic to some degree, but it also has a ridge of high pressure sitting across central parts of Europe and over on the eastern side of America as well. So the jet stream does something a bit like that during this January. It places both Eastern America and Northern and Western Europe on the mild side of the jet. So these are the closest Januaries I could find to January 2020 in terms of the 500 millibar height anomaly. We've got January 1882. What do we think about that one? I think there is a bit of a similarity there. We've got the above average heights, maybe a bit closer to it. You don't find a 100% like-for-like match, by the way, or very rarely will you find a 100% like-for-like match. But I think that's relatively close. The ridge is a bit closer to us. There's a trough extending through the Atlantic. There's a ridge on the eastern side of America, so both sides of the Atlantic are mild in January 1882. The next pattern match I found was January 1925. That came out, of course, for England Wales precipitation as well for January. This one with above average heights again across central parts of Europe. We've got this area of below average heights extending out into the middle of the Atlantic, a ridge on the eastern side of America. Let's compare the two. So that's 2020, January 2020. That's January 1925. Similarity, probably not as good as the first match. Let me know what you think in the comments which January you think is the closest match. The next January is 1932 that I could find. Again, above average heights across Central Europe, above average heights on the eastern side of America, below average heights around Greenland. Let's change the colour. Below average heights around Greenland and to our north, but also extending into the Atlantic to some degree. What do we think about that one, comparing it to 2020? Again, I think there's a similarity. Not a like-for-like match, but I think there is a similarity there between January 2020 and January 1932. January 1989 is the next one. Again, mild on both sides of the Atlantic. Ridge over on the eastern side of America. A big ridge of high pressure across central parts of Europe in January 1989. Low pressure up to the north. Probably deeper than it is this year over the northern latitudes. But nevertheless, same sort of idea. Both sides of the Atlantic are relatively mild in January 1989. Let's compare the two, and again, I think we can say there is a similarity there. Please let me know which January you think is the closest match. Then we've got January 2002. Again, we've got the ridge sitting just to the east of the UK, just there. There's a ridge on the eastern side of America. In between, we've got the trough of below average heights. Not as much low pressure in the northern latitudes in January 2002 as we had in this January. So that's not such a good match, actually. 2002, I don't think is such a good match, but there is sort of a similarity. And then 2008, again, we've got the ridge over on the east side of America, ridge through central parts of Europe down to the Azores. Quite a ridge up towards northern Russia as well, and trough of low pressure through here. Let's compare that to January 2020. Perhaps not the best of matches, but there are similarities between January 2020 and January 2008. They're the closest matches I could find anyway. So, again, not like for like, but they're the closest matches that I could find for January's 500 millibar height anomaly. Let's look at the springs that follow those Januaries. So we've got spring of 1882 with below average heights in the north and to west of the country, bringing in westerly winds. It looks like that's an unsettled, and you would have thought relatively mild spring in 1882. The next January came up, of course, the next spring, I should say, came up, of course, in our January precipitation analogues package that we started the video with. It's 1925, very, very unsettled spring. This one, a proper deluge of a spring going off the anomaly. The next spring also came up in the first analogues package. It's 1932. This one, again, with below average heights across the northwest parts of Europe, blocking up towards Green. Not only unsettled, but also a cold spring, this one, in 1932. Wind shear potential, definitely. A long gap then to the spring of 1989. And this one, with below average heights out to the northwest, looks very unsettled. It looks grim, actually. It wasn't as bad as that. March 1989 wasn't too bad. May 1989 was actually quite a dry and very warm month. Got the summer off to a hot start. In between, though, there was a cold and wet April in 1989. So that spoiled the spring a little bit. Nevertheless, that's a pretty decent spring, actually, despite that analogue. And then 2002, we see, again, this came up in the first analogues package, below average heights to the west, above average heights to the east, a lot of dry and mild weather in the spring of 2002. That's a very nice spring. And then finally 2008, the spring of 2008, is quite a cold spring with below average heights over and to the south and east of the country, blocking up towards Greenland. It sends a jet stream southwards, places us on the cold side of the jet. And yeah, that's quite a cold and unsettled spring. It does have a warm May though, but March and April, particularly the second half of March and the first half of April, have a notably cold spell with a fair amount of snow. Putting our January pattern matches together, this is how all marches, I should say, combined are looking unsettled, below average heights across the north and west of Europe. Probably not overly cold though. But the trough is sort of centred over Scandinavia, so you could pull in some cold air from the north. But there's no real northern blocking there, but it does look unsettled and potentially on the cool side. All Aprils combined looking very unsettled. Deep trough centred over the UK. It doesn't get worse than that. Very wet looking signal for April. All Mays combined start to raise the heights to the north and to the east, pushing the low pressure out to the west and turning wind a little bit more into the east-southeast. Probably quite a battleground UK type month, that, and could be potentially very unsettled as low pressure comes up against high pressure and sort of grinds to a halt. That could be quite a unsettled and relatively wet signal for May, but probably quite warm as well. Maybe even, dare I say it, a little bit thundery. And then finally, this is how all springs combined are looking following our January pattern matches. And yes, we set up below average heights over the top of the UK and much of Western Europe. It looks a very unsettled signal for these springs following our pattern matches for January. So whether the analogue comes from January precipitation or whether it comes from pattern matching, all in all, it's an unsettled signal for these springs. But we are not done there, because I'm going to pause the video and we'll be back in a moment with a little bit of February data. We're going to attempt to do some pattern matching for February, although we're a little bit shy at the end of the month, of course. But before that, we'll have a look at February CT and see where we think the central temperature is likely to end up with this February, and then have a look at other years at February CT with similar outcomes. All will be explained in a moment. We'll pause the video there. We'll see you back in around 2 seconds time, and we will conclude the 7th and final Spring 2020 Analogues update from GWV. So see you very, very soon. Okay, we're back, and we're ready to resume the 7th and final Spring 2020 Analogues update from GWV. Hope you have been enjoying the video. Please give us a like on the video. Let us know that you have enjoyed it. Let us know through the comments what you think, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're trying to get subs up as much as we can. So, in the first part of the video, we were talking about January data. We had a look at January England and Wales precipitation for the spring. Final batch of analogues sent through by James Atquill, Analogues Guru, before he went into hospital. Big thank you to James for that. And also had a look at a little bit of January pattern match. And we're going to have an attempt to do something for February now. Now, what I would really have liked to have done this February is England Wales precipitation, but it's too early to ascertain where we're coming out with this February in terms of precipitation. So we can't do that, but I think we can do the CET. So that's where we're going to go next. So the central temperature currently stands provisionally for February 2020 at 6.5. An anomaly of 2.9 degrees above the 61 to 1990 average, provisional to the 21st of the month. I don't think that's going to change a great deal from there. It's going to tick up a little bit for this weekend. It'll probably tick down a bit next week. There'll be some sort of downwards correction, I would have thought. There usually is when we get to the end of the month. I would anticipate we're going to come out somewhere between 6.0 at the low end and 6.5 at the high end. I'd be surprised if we can stick to 6.5 right the way through to the end of the month. So that gives us a central sort of baseline, perhaps around 6.2 or maybe 6.3. But it could be a bit up above that, could be a little bit below that. I think somewhere between 6.0, 6.5 is where we're likely to finish up though. So what I want to look at for our next batch of analogues, for this 7th and final Spring 2020 Analogues update, is springs following February's with a CET range of 6.0, 6.5. Remember, we are sort of pitching this a little bit. We're not certain that's where we're going to finish up, but I think really from where we are now, that will be somewhere between 6.0 and 6.5. So all these springs are following February's with a central temperature of 6.0, 6.5. The first spring is 1848, unsettled, low pressure through the north and west of Europe, high pressure up towards Greenland, a weakened area of high pressure, but it's still there. Looks like it's quite a cool, maybe relatively cold spring, and unsettled as well. The next spring is 1868. This one also looks unsettled, but it's milder. Low pressure is out to the north and west, a ridge from the Azores into southern Europe, strong westerly zonal flow. So it does look like it's an unsettled spring in 1868, quite a bit of rain, but also potentially a mild spring as well, you would have thought. The next spring, following a February CT of 6.0 to 6.5, is the spring of 1871, with some above average heights just to our west and south, deep trough over Scandinavia and in the middle of the Atlantic. Rather a bizarre looking pattern, that one. Neither one thing nor another, but I don't think it's a particularly dramatic spring either way in 1871. Unlike this one, 1877, this looks like a very, very unsettled spring indeed, with a really deep trough of below average heights across northern, central and also western parts of Europe too. Above average heights up towards Greenland, and into that area below average heights we probably push in northerly winds, so a cold and very unsettled and potentially really wet spring in 1877. 1882 is our next spring, following a February CT range of 6.0 to 6.5. This one with low pressure in off the Atlantic, and yes, in come the westerlies in 1882. Spring 1918 is turning up next. This one with below average heights just out to our west, above average heights up towards Scandinavia. Quite a warmish sort of spring, this one, I think, with winds from a sort of southeasterly to almost easterly direction and not overly unsettled. Spring 1920 is our next analogue up. This one very westerly. We're bringing in the westerlies, high pressure to the south and low pressure to the north and the northwest. Continuation of the pattern that we have through the winter of 1919-20, which was mild, unsettled and westerly. Next spring, with a following February with a CT range of 6.0 to 6.5, is the spring of 1943. This one looks quite a nice spring, with above average heights centred from the Atlantic into the UK, below average heights up to the north. Jet stream is pushed northwards as well. Quite a dry and probably fairly warm spring in 1943. Then there's an unbelievably long gap to 1995. Can you believe that? There was not a February between 1943 and 1995 with a CET between 6.0 and 6.5. I did double check that 2 or 3 times. I hope I've not got it wrong. I still find that hard to believe that there wouldn't be a February somewhere between 1943 and 1995 with a CET range of 6.0, 6.5. But that's what I came up with. Any mistakes that are made within these are entirely my fault, by the way. So if I have made a mistake there, then I'm sure somebody will let me know in the comments. But as far as I could ascertain, from 1943 to 1995, there was not a February with a CET range of 6.0, 6.5. There were some Februaries that were warmer than that, going into sort of the upper sixes and to below 7s. There were a few Februaries that did that. But for that particular range of half a degree from 6.0 to 6.5, I couldn't find a February from 1943 to 1995. So the next February has, the next spring I should say, of 1995 has above average heights out to our west and below average heights to our east. Rather a dry spring, this one. Quite cold in March of 1995. It follows a very mild and wet winter, but there is a relatively cold March in 1995 with some snow. A little bit of a cold snap in the middle of April 1995 as well. Otherwise, though, quite a warm spring, and gets very, very warm early in May 1995. A proper heat wave through the first week of May 1995 sort of hints at what the summer of 1995 has in store. The next spring is the spring of 2000. So this one, again, it has the above average heights just to our north and northwest, below average heights around there and to our south. This is quite a strange spring. It has a very wet April. March is a bit of a nondescript type month, but quite mild. And then May is quite dry and warm, I think. So a lot of variation through the spring of 2000. Spring 2011 showing up next. This is an exceptionally warm spring, particularly so in April, which is the hottest April on record. Still remains that. Below average heights up towards Greenland and Iceland, but with closest area of high pressure bringing up hot, well, very warm, for April southerly winds in 2011. 2014 also showing anticyclonic signals, high pressure sitting very close to northern and western parts of Europe. That's another very mild and dry spring. following a very wet summer, of course, of 2014. And then spring 2017, again, very anticyclonic, lots of high pressure over not just the UK, but much of Western Europe too. That's a dry and warm spring in 2017. So the final springs do throw a bit of a curveball because they turn much more anticyclonic and a lot warmer too. Putting all of that together, this is how all Marches combined are looking following a February CT of 6.0 to 6.5. And it's quite an anticyclonic signal for the Marches, with above average heights extending in from the Atlantic into Northern Europe. Below average heights are up to the north, up here, and also they're down to our south. You would expect to be bringing in some, perhaps wouldn't be expected to be bringing in easterly winds, actually. I think overall probably a bit westerly, as the jet stream would be to our north, despite that trough that's to the south. So relatively mild and quite dry for the Marches. All Aprils combined following a February CT of 6.0 to 6.5, above below average heights to our west, above average heights to our southeast. Lots more unsettled in the Aprils, but not desperately wet. I mean, it's just going to like a typical April showers type pattern, I would have thought. Relatively mild again. All Mays combined following a February CT of 6.0, 6.5, with high pressure to the south, low pressure to the north, and yes, in comes relatively mild westerly winds, so that doesn't look too bad. Probably more unsettled for the north of the country though. And then all springs combined following a February CT of 6.0, 6.5, looks like that, with below average heights, above average heights I should say, to our south, and below average heights up to the north, in come the westerlies. So a relatively mild and you would have thought quite dry spring. Particularly the later springs as well. Those final 3 or 4 later springs had a lot of dry and warm weather involved with them. So that's a slightly better Analogues package if you want a warmer and drier spring. The last thing I want to look at, again, is a little bit of pattern matching. So again, this will not be forming part of the spring forecast, but nevertheless, I did want to do a little bit of pattern matching for February. That's how things look up to the 18th of February. So again, a very westerly zonal month, more unsettled than January as well, you'll notice, with above average heights to our south and quite deep below average heights up to the north. The westerlies are coming in, an unsettled pattern for February. Now, that might change a little bit. We are shy of month's end, so that might change a little bit, but I wouldn't anticipate it'll change greatly. I think that will be broadly how the pattern looks when we come to the end of the month. So let's see which is I found that are, I think, the closest matches to February 2020. So we have the February of 1868. Annoyingly, I've just got rid of the February 2020 analogues, so I can't actually compare the two. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I think it's important to be able to compare these. So I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to get that analog back up, and I'll see you in 2 seconds' time. Sorry about that, but I just do want to compare the patterns. So let's just pause there and get February 2020's analog back. Okay, we're back, and we've got February 2020's analogue up to the 18th of February, anyway, up for you. As I said, we're short of month's end, so this might change a little bit by the time we get through to the end of February, but I will anticipate it will change greatly. So that's how February 2020 looks for its analogue. Again, unsettled, below average heights to the north, above average heights to the south. Classic westerly scenario. The ridge extends back into the Atlantic and to the eastern side of America too. So both sides of the Atlantic, similar to January, but more unsettled for us. But both sides of the Atlantic are mild with those ridges of high pressure during February. So this is the first match I found. It's February 1868. Again, this one has below pressure up to the north. The high pressure is to the south. A ridge over on the east side of America. So both sides of the Atlantic would be quite mild there. What do we think about that? Let's compare the two. What do you think? Let me know in the comments which February you think is the closest match. The next February that I could find is 1894. This one again has lots of low pressure to the north. It has the ridge to our south, extending back into the Atlantic and then over onto the eastern side of America. Again, let's compare the two. I think there's a definite similarity there. Again, you will not get a like-for-like match, or very rarely will you get a like-for-like match, but I think there is enough of a similarity for that to be able to be included. The next February Pat match is 1918, and this one, again, the two ridges on both sides of the Atlantic, one there and one just there, low pressure to the north. Comparing the two, I think that's slightly less of a match, really, because the low pressure is extending into northern Europe as much as it does in 2020. So I'm not quite as keen on that particular match, but again, there is a similarity. Then we've got 1990, a long gap then through to 1990. That's how February 1990 looks again. Ridge on the east side of America, ridge on the western side of Europe and across southwestern Europe, low pressure up to the north. Very mild February, this one, and also a very unsettled February as well. Comparing the two, definite similarity, I think, really, between those two Februaries of 1990 and 2020. Next is February 1995. This one I'm much less keen on because it's quite a lot colder for Eastern America. Look at that, we have the trough extending down into East America. But for Europe, actually, it's one of the closer matches, with the ridge coming in off the Atlantic into southern Europe, the low pressure from the North Atlantic extending into Scandinavia. So comparing the two, for Europe, it's quite a close match, but it's less good for America. It's a much colder month on the east side of America in February 1995. Next is 1997. This is a pretty good one, I think, comparing the two. February 2020. February 1997. I think there's a definite similarity with this one. Low pressure again out to the northwest, above average heights across southern, southwestern, central parts of Europe, back into the Atlantic, over to the eastern side of America. Definite similarities between those two Februaries. And then 2000. Again, it's okay for sort of Eastern America into the Atlantic. Does have a ridge more centred over Spain, if anything. Low pressure again up to the north. I mean, there's definite similarities between February 2020 and February 2000. But not one of the closer matches. Then we've got February 2002. Again, above average heights to the south, below average heights to the north. The ridge extends towards the eastern side of America as well. That, again, there are similarities. Perhaps not one of the better matches, but definite similarities with that one. So this is how the Springs, let me know in the comments which February you think was the closest match. This is how the Springs look then, following those February pattern matches. We've already seen the Spring of 1868. It's wet and unsettled, but also mild, with above average heights to the south, below average heights to the north. In come those westerly winds, and unsettled, but also mild Spring. Then we've got the Spring of 1894. I've already seen that one too, with above average heights to the northeast, below average heights to our south. That's quite a mild Spring, I think, in 1894. We've seen the Spring of 1918 as well. Interesting how these pat matches are also sort of, a lot of them are going along with the February CT data. Quite interesting. This is how Spring 1918 looks, with above average. Getting very late and I'm tired. I've done 4 videos before this video today, so it's been a really long day. 1918 is quite a warm and dry spring as well. 1990, long gap from 1918 to 1990. This one is another warm spring. High pressure centres over the country, low pressure push northwards. The hot summer of 1990 begins in the spring with a lot of warm and dry weather. That's a very, very nice spring indeed. And then we've got 1995, which we've seen in earlier Analogues 2. So this one, again, it has westerlies. It has high pressure out to west, I should say. Low pressure to our east. We bring sort of a northwesterly type flow. Again, I described what happened with this spring. It was quite cold in March. There was some snow in March. Middle of April had a cold snap. Otherwise, it was a dry and warm spring, especially so in May of 1995. Spring at 1997 is anticyclonic, with high pressure dominating precipitating through the first half of it anyway. March and April 1997 are very dry and warm months. We get through to May and it all flips around, turns much cooler and also a lot wetter as well. Spring 2000, we've already seen that one with the above average heights just out to our west and also to our south and to our north as well. Quite interesting spring, so it has quite a cold April, and it gets drier and warmer in May, so very wet in April 2000. And then 2002 been showing up a lot in this Analogues package, with high pressure to the east and low pressure out to the west, a warm and dry spring in 2002, putting all of that together. So this is how all Marches combined are looking following our February pattern matches. Anticyclonic above average heights sitting over the much of Western and Northern Europe, below average heights up to the north with jet stream push northwards as well. That's a dry and warm month in March. All Aprils combined also shows an anticyclonic signal just over and to the west of the country. Less so than in the Marches, but nevertheless quite a dryish and you would hope relatively warm signal for the Aprils. And then the May is looking very nice as well, with above average heights centred pretty much across the whole of Western Europe actually. Very interesting how that works out. A lot of dry and warm weather on offer in those Mays. Lastly, this is how all springs combined are looking following our February pattern matches, and it's not a bad analogue to close these updates off with, really, because it has high pressure centred over the UK and much of northwestern Europe. Low pressure is up to our north. The jet streams push northwards as well. A dry and warm spring ends the spring 2020 updates. And that's pretty much it. That's the final spring 2020 Analogues update. All that remains now is to do the second and final season one rounder for the spring of 2020. We're going to do that on Saturday. First video up, 10 AM Saturday morning. And then the spring forecast, which will be released, of course, on Sunday, week today, 1st of March. We'll issue the GWV Spring 2020 forecast. And I have to say, it's a bit of a struggle because these updates have been very, very variable. I'm not sure there's been a particularly consistent signal. So we're going to have to analyse the data and just see where the data is leading us, I think. But it is quite a difficult forecast, this. And I suspect it will be delivered with relatively low confidence. So more about that in the spring forecast next week anyway. Right, that's it for the spring updates. And we can do no more. What we can do now is release the spring forecast a week today. Come back later on. We've got GWV Sunday Roundup. We'll have the GFS, no we won't. We'll have the ECMWF, Meteo France and DWD seasonal model update around 3 this afternoon, something like that. And tonight on Ensembles Watch, this video will be placed on the spring updates forecast page with a written summary going over everything that we discussed in the video, and I'm going to try and get that up for you tonight. If it's not tonight, then it will be tomorrow. But at 47 minutes, this is the longest spring update that we've done to finish off with. At 47 minutes, that's all for now, and thank you so much for watching.